So hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining our Lunch and Learn. We're going to talk a little bit about scope 1, 2 and 3 today. You're probably all aware legislations that are underway, and we just wanted to have a bit of essentially cut through the chase, you could say. I wanted to get a bit of an declutter the confusion that might be sometimes there around how do we actually do it, what's the best way to do scope 1, 2, 3 reporting, how does it tie in with the existing legislation, how does it tie in with work you've done before, and where are we at in this entire ESG journey in terms of using technology to make our life easier, and why are we doing it. So we're gonna wait maybe another 3 seconds or 30 seconds. We have people joining in, and then we can start. All right, let's start. So let's do a deep dive into scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions today. This Lunch and Learn webinar has a focus on the Australian legislation. I would say my specialty is probably a lot more in the technical details. I'll cover the legislation and where we sit and how it all ties in with what's been released as legislation before, the recent documents that were released around guidelines for how to report, and just to try to bring a bit more clarity in terms of which direction is the easiest one to go for you in order to get underway with your reporting. So it's always a bit weird to see myself on screen, even wearing the same shirt as in the photo shoot. That's a bit extra weird. My name is Arne Geschke. I'm the co-founder here at Fair Supply. I've worked in supply chain assessment in an academic career at the University of Sydney for 15 years prior to Fair Supply. During that career, I've essentially looked at all aspects of mapping global supply chains, how to handle data sets so that can actually pull this off, mapping global supply chains, the gaps that were still present and are still being researched right now in terms of understanding how global supply chains can be mapped, and then most importantly, how that is linked to impacts along those supply chains. So carbon emissions is one very, very mainstream, very important impact that we of course want to measure. But one of the, I guess, truths that I discovered during my uni time was that essentially every ESG problem is at its core a supply chain problem. So the problem doesn't stop with reporting in a solid way on carbon emissions. We also have to have much better supply chain visibility for everything ESG going forward. And that's not just reporting, that's also us understanding the risks that we might be exposed to due to ESG impacts that we're feeling more and more now around the globe. So for those of you that are in Sydney, you probably heard the news about the big waves we had on the beaches last week, with significant damage to surf clubs and the rest of it. So those kinds of extreme weather events are becoming more likely, and our supply chains are tied to locations, obviously, where these things can happen. We need to understand this. So the carbon is just the beginning. We're going to dive into carbon only today, but of course we cover a lot more here at Fair Supply in terms of full supply chain visibility. So today we're going to look at the regulatory standards first, so the regulations and the standards, and want to bring a bit of sort of understanding and clarity around what does Angus mean, where is the greenhouse gas protocol sitting in all of this, what are the recent legislations, and how does it all tie together? Do they contradict one another? Do they extend one another? What's legislation? What is guideline? And what's just a cooking recipe? And then we're going to do a deep dive into the actual categorization of greenhouse gas emissions, and then everything, the entire language that the greenhouse gas protocol uses in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Then I want to wrap up with looking into the challenges that we have around data organization, data availability, how we manage supply chain assessment, and how software as a service solutions can help as we are moving, in my opinion, as we're moving away from a consulting-based only approach and more into a SaaS-supported approach that would save us a lot of time and as well as other things that often pose problems along the way. So let's get started. So the greenhouse gas protocol, for those of you, most of you, I would assume, have probably worked with the greenhouse gas protocol in their career, at least when you've touched any kind of ESG reporting in your career. So the greenhouse gas protocol is essentially what was the first, I don't want to call it legislation, was the first standard to define language and methods of how to actually report on greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the activities of a certain company. So it was developed, it's quite old already, so it was developed between 1998 and 2001, and it all happened around the Kyoto Protocol time, which was in the late 90s. And it was essentially filling the gap when these questions of how to actually report on emissions, what effects in my operations do I need to consider when I report on the associated emissions, all the rest of it. But also we're coming to a time now where it probably needs a revamp. So those of you that have worked with it, you've probably seen that concepts like working from home are not actually covered in the greenhouse gas protocol. If I work from home like I am today, the electricity that I'm using to run this webinar is this electricity that should be accounted for by Fair Supply, my company, or is this actually my private electricity? Those kinds of questions, you could say, in a changing world are not fully captured by the greenhouse gas protocol, but nevertheless, it is the underlying standard for, I would say, 99.9% of all carbon reporting, with a few exceptions. But most of the language that I've seen so far falls back on those terms that were defined in the greenhouse gas protocol. It's very important to mention, nowhere in the world is the greenhouse gas protocol actually a standalone piece of legislation. I see it more as a cooking recipe. If I want to report on carbon emissions, I have to agree on certain concepts. I have to agree on certain languages and on certain terms, and that's what's outlined in the greenhouse gas protocol. And very often legislation then refers back to the greenhouse gas protocol and says you are required to report your scope 1 and 2 emissions under the greenhouse gas protocol standards, and scope 3 emissions might have slightly different guidelines. We're often at a time in many areas in the world at the moment where scope 1 and 2 receive a lot more focus, and scope 3 is sort of coming. Nevertheless, it's very important to get ahead with scope 3 because it can be a challenging task compared to scope 1 and 2. Okay, so we've got Australian legislation in place. The greenhouse gas protocol is referenced for emissions accounting, and it's referenced in the following legislations here in Australia. We've got the Corporations Act from 2001, and that Corporations Act says certain entities, those that have relevant reporting thresholds that are often tied to revenue, need to include a sustainability report in their annual report and statements, and those must comply with the report must comply with sustainability standards, and part of that is reporting on your emissions under as outlined by the greenhouse gas protocol. I said something this morning in my LinkedIn post. For those of you who saw that, is like a sustainability report has never ever reduced emissions anywhere. It's just a report. Of course, we want to move away from that, but I think we haven't developed enough easy to use tools in a way to make reporting easy. And I think that's what's the motivation behind this webinar as well, is to show you that if we can really take a chunk of the manual work from the reporting piece away, then the reporting becomes more of a side gig, and what we can really focus on is the actual reduction in emissions, and that's where we want to get to essentially. So now we've got the AASB2, the new standard. This is a bit of a mix in my opinion. So they're climate-related metrics. So you have to disclose your absolute greenhouse gas emissions that are generated during the reporting period and expressed as metric tons of CO2 equivalent. We'll cover what that is, and classify them as scope 1, 2, and 3 as outlined in the greenhouse gas protocol, if and only if there's not another piece of legislation that you already have to follow. So you can see there's an asterisk that says there's an exception for entities that are required to report their emissions under different legislations. For example, the Angus Act. So there's a bunch of international reporting standards that also cover this. You can see at the bottom there we listed a few, but if you go through any of the reporting guidelines around the world, you will see that the fallback is always the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I should mention at this point, if you do have any questions, you can pop them into the chat. We've got a fantastic staff here on the call as well that will help me collate them all, and we can talk through questions and afterwards. I'm not sure if I need the entire hour to talk about, but we'll see. So then last week, a regulatory guideline was released by ASIC. So this caused a little bit of confusion around, is there a new legislation piece around sustainability reporting? And I can take the pressure off and say it's not. This is a guideline. This is essentially an information document that explains in further detail how the sustainability reporting should be carried out under the Chapter 2M of the Corporations Act. But it's not a new piece of legislation, and that's good, because we don't need to onboard another piece of legislation that we have to weave into our processes to report on greenhouse gas emissions. But the great thing about this regulatory guideline is that it actually helps us a lot in terms of which direction we should take in order to report on our sustainability performance. So there's a bunch of concepts here that are actually that don't follow the same, you could say, attitude that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has. So in my view, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol always looks at, you run your business for the whole year and then you stop, turn around, look at what happened in the past and report on the associated emissions. That's great for reporting, but obviously if you want to change something, it'd be better to look into the future and say, okay, this is what I want to do in the coming 12 months, in the coming 24 months. Can I already understand what the associated emissions are? And can I make decisions now that will avoid those emissions going forward, rather than putting maybe a new system in place or acquiring a new asset and then having to deal with the emissions fallout that comes from that business decision in hindsight. And you can see under point C here, there's a forward-looking climate information is required. So those are all concepts that require more work and a slightly different approach from what maybe the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was designed to do. And it's quite important to sort of keep that in mind when you go on that journey. So it's just a bit of a comparison between what you might have already come across, the ANGA Act, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So I think it's a fantastic list that was compiled by one of my colleagues who's also on the call here, and it really outlines what the intention is and how much pull that document actually has, or that framework. So if we start at the top, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the scope is that it's a global standard, and that's it. It's just a standard. And it's intended to be used by corporations and organizations to manage and measure their greenhouse gas emissions. Although the concepts could be used by governments and countries, that's not the intention of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But for the purposes of our conversation here today, that's exactly what we need. We need a corporate standard to know how we measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions. The ANGA Act, that's the piece of legislation. So that says reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, energy production and consumption by certain entities, and it's set up as a system to track who emits what, and the regulatory compliance is part of that piece of legislation. And then the list continues. I don't want to go through everything, but you can see that they're interlinked, but they don't fully overlap. So for example, the jurisdiction, that's probably a very strong word for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but it is intended for global use and it is used globally. I'm not aware of any competing standards that are used widely anywhere else. The ANGA Act, of course, is an Australian federal legislation piece, and as such, its scope is within Australia. Its jurisdiction is Australia. Interestingly, the ANGA Act only focuses on scope 1 and 2 so far. It's a very narrow focus, but at the same time, there's a lot of guidelines around what should actually be done to measure that. So the focus is quite narrow, in a way that's good, because those are emissions that can be controlled much more directly than scope 3 emissions. But at the same time, especially for manufacturing and especially for services, so sort of like finance, for example, financial service institutions, the scope 3 component can be quite substantial. And so the legislation, similar to the Anger Act for the financial field, for example, wouldn't really target the right emissions passes to really make a dent. So, and then we have the flexibility in the methodology for the greenhouse gas protocol. I think I talked to one person once who was on the working group for the greenhouse gas protocol 25 years ago, and that person said to me, it was quite a stretch to get to a point where we could actually agree on language, methods, and other things where everybody was in agreement that this is something that can be put out as a global standard. So it was that tension between putting too much work and too many tasks onto the corporates, and at the same time having a useful standard on the other hand. So as a result of that, there's a lot of flexibility in the methodologies. We will see that later in one of the slides. There's a decision tree often that determines which method you should use to report on your Scope 3 emissions, rather than a very strict requirement for methodological adherence. It often depends on what information can you actually get your hands on, how reliable is this information, and also relates to maybe the resources that a company might have to actually undertake this exercise, as well as materiality thresholds and the rest of it. So, and you can see one of the bullet points down there is there's an encouragement in the greenhouse gas protocol that says it encourages the use of company-specific data or best available data, but it doesn't say you have to have this type of data to do this, otherwise it's not valid. Anger comes in from a completely different angle and says there's certain things, these are the calculation guidelines, you have to adhere to this. And that's where the limitation of the emission scopes to Scope 1 and 2 is essentially, that's the compromise, because you can only put these strict adherences around emissions where that data is actually available, and really strict calculations can be followed by everyone who this applies to. So now we're starting to enter what I spend, I'd say, most of my days with, including the last few days. So became pretty clear very early on that what a company emits within its own operations is not enough. That's not enough in order to understand the overall impact. And the concept of supply chains at the time when the greenhouse gas protocol was designed was in its infancy. So the mathematical methods were established, but things like tracking supply chains across the globalized economy is something that wasn't possible 25 years ago. Those techniques and those data sets and the understanding also that we're using here at Fair Supply, for example, that stuff is fairly recent knowledge, and it's only about 10 to 12 years old, I would say. And at the same time, there was an understanding at the time that there are supply chains that need to be considered when really reporting and understanding the impact of individual businesses. And in my opinion, the compromise was to find these ways to put language around those concepts without defining too strictly how they should be interpreted. But if we start at the beginning, it's actually quite intuitive. So at the beginning, we have the Scope 1 emissions, and the Scope 1 emissions are essentially what is burned on site. And for many companies, this is essentially the vehicle fleet. It might be a bit of company facilities. So for example, if you have diesel generators on site, obviously if you are a energy producer and you run assets like power stations, obviously there's a lot of combustion going on. If you are a transport company, there's a lot of combustion of fuels going on in your vehicles. So those kinds of Scope 1 emissions are, you could say, the intuitive emissions. If this is where the greenhouse gas protocol ended, this is also the perfect way to cheat. And I think that's why Scope 2 and Scope 3 were included. Because if you only had to report on what's actually being burned on site, the easiest way would be to outsource that and make it someone else's problem. At a global scale, that actually happens. I've seen it a number of times when I did greenhouse gas assessments, screening and inventory for companies, both in my academic role and here at Fair Supply, where through the screening process was identified that, for example, the catering in the restaurant of the company was carrying the biggest amount of direct emissions, or the biggest amount of emissions that were associated with the company operations. And as a result, the company decided to essentially outsource that to a third-party company and bring the catering in and just pay for it. And that way, the emissions moved from Scope 1 to Scope 3, although the kitchen was still being operated within the company premises. And those kinds of tricks, it's not a trick, but those kinds of effects are effects that there's almost no place to hide in the greenhouse gas protocol, because we have the concepts of supply chain emissions as well within the greenhouse gas protocol. But if you take a step back and think about it at a global level, the changes in our economy over the last 30 years have actually seen those effects quite significantly. So if you look at the UK, for example, the UK, we're a very strong and big steel producer. I would say 30, 40 years ago, that industry has essentially disappeared now, and most of the steel used in the UK is now imported. So the emissions associated with the production of steel is not part of the UK balance sheet anymore for emissions. It's now someone else's problem, and the emissions are essentially indirectly imported. Now, the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't offer these kinds of measures, and that's why we need to talk about the supply chain emissions. So, moving one step further, in this case to the left, we have the Scope 2 emissions. These are supply chain emissions, but they're very special and, in my opinion, again, very intuitive supply chain emissions. And those emissions associated with a purchased energy that is purchased by the company that is reporting. So in most cases, that's electricity, especially here in Australia. In some areas of the world, like where I'm from, in Germany, there's also long-distance hot water supply, where power stations that are close to urban hubs essentially sell their waste heat as hot water, and houses are heated with that water. But that's not something we do here in Australia. And purchased electricity is essentially the big part here. It's fairly straightforward to get to the associated emissions. The carbon intensity of the Australian electricity grid is publicly available. You can go to the AEMO website and look at the carbon intensity of the Australian grid right now in real time, and you know how much you're purchasing in terms of energy, and as such, you can very easily figure out what your Scope 2 emissions are. Maybe the word easily I should put into inverted commas here, because there's always more work than you realize. The big one is Scope 3 emissions. And in terms of complexity, and for some reporting entities, it's also actually the contribution to the overall exposure. Scope 3 can hold quite a lot of weight. For example, here at Fair Supply, we are a service company. We have 0 Scope 1 emissions. We do not maintain our own vehicle fleet. We do have Scope 2 emissions, obviously, to run our equipment at the office, but the majority of what's sitting in our carbon report is essentially Scope 3. Often around the equipment that we buy, but also business travel and other items. So it's very important to understand Scope 3. Also, companies have a lot of capex expenditure. Scope 3 is very important to understand what is the equipment cost that comes in. So, in my opinion, Scope 3 at the time was probably a bucket for everything that was too hard to get to. The situation is now that we do have the methods to get to these, and so Scope 3 requires quite a bit of work, and it can be quite overwhelming when you start off into the journey, especially if you have a really good grasp on Scope 1 and Scope 2, because the approaches to getting to Scope 3 are often quite different. And then on top, we have all these different gases that need to be considered. We're going to talk about those in the next slide. So for those of you that joined our summer school a few weeks back, we had a session where we actually talked about first of all, how gases interact in the atmosphere with the heat that comes in from the sun, and how the greenhouse gas effect actually works. And part of that understanding is that almost every gas that we emit in our economy, in whatever form, so the majority is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. All of those gases, including the other ones, the other three that are for me sometimes a bit hard to pronounce, they all have some kind of warming effect in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide's actually the nicest one, but because we emit it in such great quantities, it's still the dominant one. Methane is significantly more potent in its climate warming, global warming effect, and as you go down the list, the amounts that we emit of these gases become very, very small, but the climate potency becomes very, very large. Okay, so why is this important? This is important because we need to understand, we need to bring it all together. And you've heard the term CO2 equivalent probably before, and that's exactly where this is going to, where this is heading. So what's happening constantly in the research world is we're trying to understand how 1 ton of methane, if I wanted to cause the same damage with CO2, how much CO2 would I have to emit to cause the same damage as I cause with 1 ton of methane? And that number is called the carbon dioxide equivalent, or the global warming potential. It's the global warming potential of methane. And it's moving, it's still changing, because our understanding of these global warming potentials is still developing. And every time the IPCC release a new report, so we're up to the Global Assessment Report 6, I believe, there's always updated global warming potential figures. And the current one for methane sits around 28. So 1 ton of methane causes the same damage as 28 tons of carbon dioxide. But in the past it was lower. It was at 25 for a while, and then further research was done to understand how that behaves in the atmosphere. There's a number of other effects that we covered in the summer school especially, and this is where it becomes quite geeky and quite academic in nature. That's not the avenue we're taking in this Lunch and Learn, but there's a lot of work that goes into this. But what trickles out in the end, and what's relevant for you when you're reporting your carbon emissions, is that you need to understand these global warming potentials, and you need to understand how these gases are translated into the equivalent of carbon dioxide. And if you have 1 ton of methane, 1 ton of methane is the CO2 equivalent of 28 tons. And that's where this term CO2 equivalent comes from. So every gas is translated into CO2, and it's then called CO2 equivalent if it's not carbon dioxide. And that's then the one number that you can report on your company. So all of that pre-work, how you get to those global warming potentials, how you translate those gases with the right numbers into the carbon dioxide equivalent, all that's done on our end before you would even interact with air supply, so you don't have to worry about that. And I think that's one of these important steps that we're going to talk about later in terms of data management and stuff, where we just need to move away from spending too much time on managing data when that can actually be automated. So scope 1 and 2, conceptually easy. From a data collection perspective, can be quite complex. So imagine you are maybe a transport company with 50 hubs across Australia. Within these warehouses, you have dozens of forklifts operating. There might be solar panels on some of those roofs where you can offset your electricity consumption. Maybe there's even a backup generator somewhere. There's, like, of course, trucks that are driving back and forth. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be considered in order to understand what the scope 1 and 2 emissions are. But they can be boiled down into these five categories here. So stationary combustion, generators, for example, one weird one is, I always like as an example, is Sydney Water has a number of wastewater treatment plants here in Sydney, one's in Bondi, and they actually produce from that wastewater quite a lot of methane. And that methane is actually used and captured, and is then used in a cogen unit to generate electricity. And when there's excess electricity, Sydney Water actually sells that into the grid. So that's stationary combustion. So the emissions for that would sit within scope 1 and 2. Then we've got mobile combustion, that's vehicles, process emissions, it's like chemical reactions, things like when you go to hospital, maybe a child has a general anesthetic and they get a nitrous oxide mask to start the anesthetic. Those are process emissions where industrial gases, it's actually fugitive emissions, but process emissions are emissions where chemical reactions cause certain emissions. And then we have agricultural emissions. Those are actually not insignificant at all. So things, emissions from soil, emissions from livestock. So when the cows burp, they burp methane, and actually quite a bit. So producing a kilo of beef carries quite a significant carbon exposure when the methane is not captured. And then we also have the effects of fertilizer on soil. So there's lots of stuff that's happening. We've talked about scope 2 already, so I don't think I need to need to cover those. The struggle or the challenge with Scope 2 now is that often that companies are looking towards using solar panels and offsetting their emissions and or offsetting the electricity costs at least. And so that has to be taken into account, because if you use a certain amount of electricity per year, but only say 60% of that was sourced from the grid, the rest was made in-house from the solar panels, that's of course something you want to include in your report, because first of all it reduces emissions, but it also reduces costs. And so that's something we of course want to track, because that's one of the angles to actually decarbonize the operations going forward. This is my happy place. Scope 3 value chain analysis. I did this before I had even heard the term Scope 3. In academia, this is often called carbon footprinting. And this can be a massive challenge. So first of all, you have all these different, first of all, you have the concept of upstream and downstream emissions. So there's lots of questions around how far upstream, up to tier 1, which is my direct suppliers, should I go further? Should I go to tier 2, which is the suppliers of my direct suppliers, or should I go even further? If you want to do this by hand, and you want to maybe call up all of your suppliers and say, hey, I'm doing my Scope 3 emissions, can you tell me where you buy your stuff so I can call your suppliers and ask what they are emitting? You're going to run out of puff very, very quickly. So there's data solutions that need to be used, or that also need to be provided in order to help. Otherwise, we're spending all our time and a lot of resources on actually getting to the number without even having done anything to reduce our emissions. And so once we get our head around that we're going upstream and downstream, you can see that there's a bunch of categories that these Scope 3 upstream and downstream emissions are actually separated into. And that makes the Scope 3 world quite a complex one. And what I found interesting when I started working in this field is that I had worked on solutions for Scope 3 emissions that can also be applied to other fields in my academic path, that could actually cover quite a bit of these and at least give you a good head start. But there's a significant gap between an academic capability and a usable application in business. And I think that gap is still quite big, and it's hard for companies to find in a way quick way in for Scope 3, and so it can often become quite expensive, or it can become quite tedious. And I think not just from my viewpoint as a co-founder of Fair Supply, but also as a global citizen on this planet that's heating up, we have to move away from that. It shouldn't be work to assess our emissions. We should put our work into reducing those emissions. And this webinar is essentially intended to give you the starting point in terms of what you actually need to do, the understanding around it, and also a point you in a direction where there are solutions that could help you along the way. So if you want to drill into these categories, at first this can be quite overwhelming. So if you look at category 1 and 2, purchase goods and services and capital goods, those are actually, for most companies, 90% of the Scope 3 emissions. It's purchase goods and services and capital goods. You could say the boundary between the two is a bit fluid sometimes. So we've worked with car manufacturers, and usually vehicles are considered capital goods under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in general. But it's always up to the reporting company to make that final decision where those emissions should be allocated or should be reported. And especially when we started to work with vehicle companies or car manufacturers, they often said, no, for us, a car part is not a capital good. We have to buy those car parts in order to build our cars. So that's purchase goods and services. So there's no such thing as like one size fits all approach to Scope 3 reporting. There's often a lot that needs to be really understood around the processes of the reporting company. The other ones are conceptually often quite clear. It's probably a lot harder to get to the information, and that's where I think solutions, data-driven solutions, really can help a lot. They can't take everything away yet, in my opinion, but they can help a lot, and they can save a lot of money. So for example, fuel and energy-related activities sounds a bit like Scope 2, because isn't that what we do, energy reporting under Scope 2? But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says these are fuel and energy-related activities that are not covered under Scope 2. So what this means essentially is you buy your electricity from the power station, and the emissions at the power station go into your Scope 2. and what's left over, so the supply chains to the power station, which is where's the coal mined, the capex of the power station, how is it operated, all the rest of it, that goes into scope 3. How do you get to that information? We're going to cover that in a few slides. Then on the right hand side, all of that stuff's downstream. The greenhouse gas protocol is nowhere near as prescriptive when it comes to downstream assessments as it is for upstream. The focus is still on upstream quite a bit. So, for example, for upstream, the greenhouse gas protocol says or recommends that you dive as deep into your supply chain tree as you can. So, if you are able to get to information around tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 of your own supply chain, your upstream supply chain, then include that into your reporting. For downstream emissions, the focus usually stops after the direct customer that you're working with. So when you sell your goods, that's often then where the horizon or where the system boundary ends. What I find interesting is that even very large companies with a lot of resources are still confused around this. At least a few years ago, that was still the case. So I looked at a sustainability report of a big mining company that sold iron ore and coal, and there was confusion around, should we put the coal into final use of products, or is it the processing of sold products? And again, the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't always give you the right answers. It gives you a few hints, and I think that's where a certain philosophy has to be decided on, that needs to be disclosed in the report, and then you can run with that. And that's again something where we can help, where we can also utilize our data engine underneath to give you a good head start. So, if you actually want to report on emissions, for each of those categories we just covered, upstream and downstream, there's a decision tree that looks a bit like this. This is probably one of the more complicated ones, but you can see on the top left, there's always the word based on screening. Based on screening, does this purchase, good or service contribute significantly to your scope 3 emissions? What is screening? Screening is again a non-descriptive technique to essentially do a first cut, have a look at all your suppliers and all your customers and say, is that material to my overall carbon exposure? Yes or no? And then once that decision's been made, or that information has been obtained, you can go through this decision tree and say, yes, it is a material piece of a material amount of emissions, so I should go into more detail. So you move to the right. Are the data available in the physical quantity of the purchased goods and service? If yes, move to the right. Can the tier 1 supplier provide product level or cradle to gate data? And often that's not the case. And there's a little asterisk to it that says, even if they can, you have to make sure that data is reliable. And if not, you trickle all the way back down to the bottom to something called the spend-based method. And the spend-based method is, in my opinion, the silver bullet in this entire scope 3 reporting adventure. And the reason for that is each and every one of you in your companies would know what you spend your money on. There's probably nothing in a company that is more understood than the expenses. And there are very sophisticated, good ways to use the spend data to model the emissions out from the spend data. We're going to cover that in a second. You've probably come across spend-based emissions factors. They are geared towards this, but there is a way to essentially run at least a screening where you can screen your entire upstream suppliers from a spend-based perspective simply by using the amount that you've spent on the supplier, if you have the right data sources underneath, to get a first idea which one is going to contribute a lot to my scope 3 exposure and which one is going to contribute a little. And that's going to save, if you can automate that, that's going to save you months of time and quite a lot of money. So, without going too much into detail how we do this, I just want to give you an overview today, but believe me, I can talk about the ins and outs of how this is actually done under the hood for hours, and my colleagues here on the call would be able to confirm that, because I've talked about this for hours to them. So I just want to sort of bring it back to what are the key challenges when you measure and report on your emissions. So it can be really complex. Imagine you are in a big construction company and you have like several dozen projects on the go. You have maybe 15 to 20,000 suppliers on these projects. On some sites you're plugged into electricity grid. On some sites you have your diesel generators. There's lots of goods flying around. it can be unbelievably expensive and time time intensive to actually run through a full supply chain assessment. But there's a lot of information already in your systems that you can use to automate that. Still, we still live in a time, and I often compare that to, some of you might still remember internet cafes. Internet cafes was essentially a service to provide internet access. That doesn't exist anymore. Internet access is now provided through a product. Everyone's got a phone, everyone's got a computer. No one goes traveling anymore and like runs to internet cafe to write an email. We all have our products that give us internet access. And it's similar to with ESG. ESG for a long time, in carbon reporting in particular, was a service approach. And there are companies that offer a consulting-based approach on carbon reporting. That's often very time-intensive and it's very expensive. And that's, I think, we're moving away from that. We're moving now into a time where we have much more data support. We have software support that takes a lot of that very labor and time-intensive part away. And so the aim underneath is then, and that's in a way my mission here at Fair Supply and the mission of the entire company is twofold. One is we need to have sophisticated data engines, people that do the data research, that things like the global warming potentials I talked about before, people that map the supply chains, that understand emissions along supply chains, that make sure these assessment approaches are in line with the greenhouse gas protocol, so that you essentially don't have to spend any time on reporting, or at least not much. And you can really focus your time on decarbonization in your operations. And secondly, I think that needs to be extended to a full sweep of risks in the supply chain, not just focus it on ESG, but everything that's going on in the world. You're probably all following the tariff developments. Those are also supply chain risks to companies, as tariffs are imposed on goods halfway around the world. Those additional costs, they trickle through supply chains as well, and have an impact on every company's bottom line. So having a sophisticated, robust data framework for a full sweep of supply chain risk assessment would always encompass ESG, but it has to be easy to use, it has to be forward-looking, and that's, I think, where we have to move into also with ESG reporting. This slide is a lot more wordy than I wanted it to be, and I'm sorry about that. But I wanted to point out a few of the data challenges that I've seen in the past. So first of all, it's data disparity. You need to pull in all the information from within your company. So what is the forklift petrol consumption in my site in Western Australia? What is the expenditure on CapEx somewhere on the East Coast? All that has to be pulled together within the company. It can be very misaligned. It can be owned by different stakeholders. Some might be willing to help you, some might be too busy. So it can be quite difficult. The second thing is then you have to overlay that with your emissions data, with your environmental data. That also has to come from somewhere. And you have to understand how these data pieces work. Are they in line with the legislation? And it's often very manual, and it's a bit like death by Excel spreadsheet. And what we found is that people that talk to us, they often come into the first calls we have with them, and they're quite overwhelmed. Maybe in some cases I would use the word panicky, and they say it's just a lot going on. I need help to find my way through this. There's so much I need to pull together, and this landed on my desk 6 months ago. Now I'm in charge of this, and I'm not quite sure how. And that's a huge challenge with ESG reporting. The second thing is centralization, data management, and legacy. Essentially, if we pull it all together in an Excel spreadsheet, it works, we can report on it, but what we've seen is that somebody might look after this process for 2 or 3 years and then might change jobs. And the approach that this person took, essentially the legacy management of how this is then continued, gets lost. And so this is something that wouldn't happen anymore in other areas, because we often have support systems and software solutions that help us, that the entire knowledge base is still there, even though a key stakeholder leaves. And that's something where ESG, I think, has to catch up. We have to have really robust managing tools that do this. And then we have the role definition. So that's something that we've seen a lot, is when people are put into positions like, say, sustainability managers or sustainable procurement managers, that there's often a lot of tension around data rigor. Then there's internal stakeholders. You might have to manage your own board that might only just coming on board now in terms of what ESG risks actually are. Then there's the external reporting piece, which is why this started in the first place. And then there's also often the business case. Does this actually, how much money does this cost, and what do we actually gain from that? And if we can clean all these data challenges up, then you can actually turn the business case around very quickly. You can say, because I can do this really quickly, I can pre-screen suppliers in terms of our carbon exposure if we onboard them into our supplier list. There's a lot of headaches in the future that you can avoid if you have the right tools at hand. I just want to dive into this quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it. A spend-based method is a data-heavy method like there's no tomorrow. So I have a very brief example here. So you have a reporting entity at the bottom. This reporting entity procures a lot of goods and services from the direct suppliers, and that's usually where the visibility of the reporting entity ends. So what we do here at Fair Supply is we use a global supply chain database that we maintain in-house, which is a very, you could say, very unique approach, and it's a very data-heavy and very sophisticated approach to use the expense data to understand how the reporting entity interacts with the global economy. And we're then able to track the dollars that flow through the global economy in order to for our reporting entity to be able to make the purchases that it made. And in the second step, we overlay these supply chains with the carbon data. So this entire methodology has a very clunky name. I'm going to say it anyway. It's called Environmentally Extended Multi-Regional Input-Output Analysis. And that's what I spent 15 years of my time at uni to research these frameworks. And the entire methodology received a Nobel Prize in the 1970s for its ability to screen supply chains, and it also builds the foundation for a spend-based screening according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It is really complex to maintain, and most ESG companies do not go that extra mile to actually screen the entire supply chains. They use a boiled-down version of that. And that's often what you've seen as spend-based emissions factors, which is essentially a similar piece of information boiled down to a single number. So a lot of information gets lost, a lot of visibility gets lost, and also further supply chain screening for problems with supply chains is not possible. So we are maintaining a supply chain network here at Fair Supply in order to be able to do all that. And there's a lot going on. So when we work with, especially with larger customers, we easily screen tens of millions of supply chains for them before we deliver the results back to them. But that's all happening under the hood. This is a wordy slide that I don't want to go through. The slide deck will be sent around afterwards, I believe. It's essentially a summary of what I said. You can go through this, and if you have any questions that come up afterwards, happy to catch up again and talk through this. But it's essentially a summary of how we do things. So, I don't know where this is point one, but I just wanted to have a quick cover, and I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm speeding up a bit. I just want to touch on emissions factors a little bit, so you know what the difference is. So first of all, they're cousins. Our approach of this maintaining 60 billion supply chains under the hood and doing the carbon assessment on top of that, that approach is very much related to emissions factors. And the relation is that emissions factors are often built using very similar frameworks that are nowhere near as detailed as what we maintain under the hood. But you can essentially, if you have a supply chain network, no matter how small it is, you can simulate what it would look like to buy $1 million. And then you can simulate the emissions along and boil it all down, and then a number pops out in the end, and that's your Scope 3 emissions factor that is often given in kilotons of CO2 per $1 million spent. So all of that stuff is boiled into one number. As I said before, it's a very valid approach. It's in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It takes away, it's easier to use. It takes away a lot of the visibility you want to have into your supply chains, because the visibility stops after your direct suppliers. But the starting point is the same. So the reporting entity has to use its expenditure data and the spend-based emissions factors for the first screening. And then you can go from there and see whether you have to go into more detail and dig deeper to get to the truth, what you need for your reporting activity. So we're going to go through this in a bit more detail here, a bit more speedy. So essentially what we could do is we could use our framework and like throw all the information about the supply chains overboard and just say, I'm only using our complex supply chain framework to build customer-specific spend-based emissions factors, we would lose so much information and so much value that we always wanted to maintain the full visibility that we have throughout the supply chains. But the important message is this is essentially the same approach with a lot more detail. Like we're going that extra mile to really understand what's going on. And the things that you learn through that, for example, is if you have a very carbon intensive supplier and you want to understand, oh, if I talk to that supplier and work on mitigation strategies for their carbon exposure, because that would also benefit my carbon exposure, is that an easy task? And there's essentially two answers, yes or no. The answer is yes, if the emissions actually sit with your supplier. And the answer is no, if the emissions that you screened are actually not sitting with your supplier, but within the supply chains of your supplier. And we've had cases where companies came to us and said, we think this is a very carbon intensive supplier, but that supplier doesn't know anything about that. And that's because they actually had those scope 3 emissions hidden in their own supply chains and they weren't aware of it. So those kinds of insights that helps you rank sort of who you're going to work with first, where you're going to get the best return on investment in terms of mitigation efforts. Those kind of decisions can be assisted by having full visibility throughout the supply chains, and that's why I think this is so important, aside from everything non-carbon that we also need to understand about supply chains. Okay, so this is again a very wordy slide to bring it all together. I guess the only thing I want to focus on is the hybrid approach. So what we are doing is essentially we understand the global economy at a very great level of detail, but not all the way down to a company level of detail. That information would be way too data intensive and it's also confidential. We do understand the global economy at the same level that the Australian Bureau of Statistics understand the Australian economy. And this hybrid approach allows us to actually link an individual company that works with us as the reporting entity into this global supply chain framework. So we get the best of both worlds. We get the company-specific behavior within the global economy, and we also get a full coverage of all upstream supply chain emissions without having to cut the boundary of the assessment off. So it's a very powerful approach to put it all together. That's what it looks like when it's done. Because we have full visibility across the supply chains, we can pre-sort your emissions into the different scope 3 buckets. We have scope 1, scope 2 modules in the dashboard as well, in order to bring it all together. And it's really a low touch environment that addresses a number of points that we had before. I am rapidly running out of time, so I will only touch on the emissions analysis downstream briefly. Downstream is very similar to upstream. The only difference is that you need to know what you're selling and you need to know who you're selling it to. Because if you sell a car to a taxi company, the emissions of that car are going to be significantly different than if you sell a car to a private household. So those effects are also onboarded and used in our dashboard. I put a supply chain tree example in here. I'm not going to talk through this in detail now, so we've got a bit of time for questions in the end. But you can go through the slide deck afterwards. This is the last slide I wanted to show. So this webinar, this Lunch and Learn, we didn't put a demo of our platform into it. Obviously, this was mainly an information session. But the challenges that we talked about in terms of data streamlining, how to actually manage the reporting activities within your company, how to pull the numbers together, having access to sophisticated large-scale data sets underneath that actually run the carbon assessments for you, all this is brought together within our tool. There's a dedicated scope 1 and 2 component in the tool that lets you easily record what's going on. And it happened, like, there's a lot of problems that get solved along the way. So you're saving a lot of time, you're saving, there's no legacy issues because the dashboard lives on, even if somebody leaves the company. And there's a number of things that we see as quite valuable. Obviously, this is mainly an information session, but as my co-founder always says, there's no such thing as a free lunch. We would love, of course, to talk to you about this, but that's not the focus of today. I think I am at the end and would like to launch into Q&A. and have a sip of water as my voice recovers. Thank you for listening. I think we only have 2 questions here. You can also ask through your mic if you want. So, civil construction company, the company pays for head office employee fuel card. Should we consider this scope 1 or scope 2? This is one of these philosophical things. So, the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't so much go into what's the accounting problem here or what's the accounting situation with scope 1 or scope 3. It's more around do you have direct control over the emissions? So if your employees are driving because they were essentially directed to do so in their job and you give them a fuel card, I would argue this is a scope 1 situation. But I've never seen, I think there's just as many arguments to say this is a scope 3 situation. For example, if you hire a car and then people use the hire car, there's in some cases I've seen it where it's accounted to scope 3. I would probably more put it into scope 1 because you have direct control over the emissions. Yeah, this is one of these wonderful case-by-case things. Okay, what else do we have? Yeah, so somebody has left already. Yes, we can share the slides definitely. Let's reduce level. Okay. Well, what I would recommend for data emissions factors, spent data emissions factors in Australia. You mean that's for John? Do you mean in terms of where to get them? Is that what you mean? Okay. So there's so every spend-based emissions factor is the result of a huge data crunching and modeling exercise, and that's one of my key jobs here at Fair Supply is essentially crunching these data models. There's no internationally prescribed way of doing this. No one says ABS data is good for this and OECD data is not good for this. There's a whole bunch of decisions you have to make along the way when you want to get scope 3 data. So we have enough data sets under our hood and the capability in-house that we calculate our own scope 3 emissions data, and that's essentially a combination of a global supply chain database, lots of maths, emissions data sets that sit on top of that, and 15 years of work at Sydney Uni that bring all that together. We had these emissions factors assured by ERM against publicly available scope 3 emissions factors to show that we are heading in the same direction here, and the differences between our data sets and those that are published by the EPA in the States are within acceptable boundaries. So my answer is biased, and John, I'd say best ones are at Fair Supply. Okay, business travel. Business travel, that's a tricky one, because you can screen business travel from a spend perspective. You know how much you're spending on plane tickets and other things. But when you actually want to go one step further and not just screen and go to the actual scope 3 inventory, there are quite strict guidelines in terms of how that's done. And I don't have the actual data source in my head now, but there's certain factors for one flight mile in business class versus 1 flight mile in economy class, and there's ways to get to that. I would have to refer you to data sets that are listed in the greenhouse gas protocol for that. I don't have them in my head, I'm sorry. Lena, with more people working from home, the emissions are considered scope 1, 2, or 3. That depends. It depends on what you are on what you're doing. So, as I said before, if I'm here at home and my computer is turned on and I'm talking to you, I would say that's a very strong case to argue that these are scope 2 emissions that belong to my company, because it's an energy that I use, associated emissions coming from that energy consumption, and that's bang on scope 2 emissions. But the greenhouse gas protocol is blind when it comes to working from home. It's also blind from working from overseas. Things like even things like, if you don't have your computer anymore and you do most of your computing work on a cloud service, those are all concepts that didn't exist for the greenhouse gas protocol. But at the same time, there's no one there that's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, you're not doing a good job at reporting, because those things are not defined. What I always find interesting is what happens when you cook a meal at home, and it's a meal that you would otherwise buy when you're at work, and you turn on your gas stove and you actually have Scope 1 emissions for your meal. Is that considered your meal for home, or is that considered for work? I don't have the answer for that. Spend on taxis. That's a fairly straightforward one. You can either do a spend-based approach where you say this is how much I spend on taxis, and the average average carbon emissions per dollar spent on taxi transport, which is available through our system. You can use that. It's not going to be as accurate as actually saying how many kilometers did I travel by taxi, which is not always information you could get to. But just to round it off, it's really only important to go to that level of detail if taxis are a material contribution to your Scope 3 exposure. So when you work in the construction industry, taxis will be a very minor item compared to all the raw materials you need to procure to actually carry out the construction projects that you're involved in. So it's all about materiality. If taxis are the main contributor to your Scope 3 exposure, I think at that point you're probably at a point where you would go into more detail anyway and maybe have your own vehicle fleet. I hope that answers the question. We've got -1 minute left. I'm happy to do one more question, but I'm also happy to wrap it up. Okay. Thank you so much for joining. Amongst all the chaos that's going on in the world, that you made the time to talk with me about ESG emissions. Always happy to continue the chat. But for now, I hope you guys have a good day, and see you later.